They thought erasing my name would erase my power. 15 years of my life built the system that kept their empire alive, every sleepless night, every broken promise to my family written in its code. But when Victoria Kane stood in front of the boardroom and crowned it the Kane Empire, she didn't know. The license was still mine. I am Ethan Cole. And I was silent that morning, not because I was defeated, but because I knew one day my silence would be the blade that cut them down. I remember the way the conference room felt that morning, heavy with the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. The glass walls looked out over downtown Boston, polished and bright, but inside it felt like a trap closing in. My hands rested flat on the table, palms damp as if I already knew what was about to happen. Victoria Kane stood at the head of the table, her tailored navy suit sharp enough to cut glass, her voice smooth and deliberate. She had been CEO of Helixon for only 3 months, but she carried herself like she had owned the building for decades. I had been at Helixon for almost 15 years. Metasight was my life's work, a predictive framework I had built line by line, test after test, through endless nights while my marriage fell apart and my health teetered on the edge. I had nurtured that system from a fragile prototype into a backbone capable of handling multi-million-dollar hospital networks. Every algorithm, every safeguard, every invisible patch bore my fingerprints. And yet that morning I sat in the second row of the boardroom like a bystander, my name scrubbed from the screen at the front. Nathan Miller, seated 2 chairs away, could barely contain his smirk. He was younger than me, 37, ambitious to the point of desperation. His tie was slightly crooked, his posture exaggeratedly confident, the way a man sits when he knows he has the blessing of the boss. He avoided looking at me directly, but I could feel his triumph radiating across the table like heat from a furnace. Victoria began her presentation with practiced ease, clicking through slides that were all too familiar. I recognized the color-coded graphs, the efficiency models, even the sample dashboards. They were mine. I had created every one of them down to the naming conventions. They had not even bothered to change the file names in some cases. Yet as she spoke, she credited Nathan for leading the charge into the new era. I sat motionless, my breath shallow. My colleagues shifted in their seats, some stealing quick glances at me. Others deliberately looking anywhere else. A few wore masks of sympathy, but none of them spoke. No one wanted to risk being on the wrong side of Victoria Kane. She paced in front of the projector, her heels clicking on the polished floor. Her words were calm, measured, confident. She described how Helixon was entering a bold chapter, one defined not by individual brilliance, but by collective vision. The phrase collective vision landed in my ears like a hammer. What she meant was erasure. Nathan cleared his throat at one point, adding a few remarks about streamlining processes. His voice trembled slightly, betraying that he had little idea what he was talking about. But Victoria nodded as if he had just revealed a groundbreaking strategy. Applause followed, short and forced, but enough to cement the charade. My stomach churned. I remembered the first night Metasight had finally run without crashing, the relief that had washed over me as the simulations balanced perfectly. I had called my wife back then, waking her after midnight, telling her that all the sacrifices might finally pay off. That was years ago. Now my wife was gone, my son barely spoke to me, and my work was being stripped from me piece by piece under the glow of fluorescent lights. I wanted to speak. I wanted to stand to remind them that without me, none of these systems would exist, that every hospital contract Victoria was parading had been secured on the back of my design. But my tongue felt like stone, my jaw locked tight. Victoria stopped in the center of the room, her gaze sweeping across the table. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then she said it, her voice steady, her eyes cold. From this day forward, Metasight will no longer be the product of any one individual. It will be the symbol of the Kane Empire. The words landed like a blade. A few people clapped hesitantly. Others nodded, pretending to agree. Nathan smiled broadly, his hands folded neatly on the table as if he had been preparing for this coronation all his life. I sat still, my hands tightening into fists beneath the table where no one could see. The humiliation burned, but deeper than the humiliation was something colder, sharper, a realization forming like ice in my veins. They thought they had erased me. They thought my silence was defeat. But as Victoria's voice echoed through the boardroom, I knew something they did not. I lowered my eyes to the notes in front of me. Blank pages on a legal pad. I wrote nothing. I did not need to. Every detail of Metasite lived in my head, every flaw, every safeguard, every hidden line of logic I had planted years ago. I listened as she claimed my work as her empire, and I swallowed the rage, burying it deep where it could sharpen into something stronger. The meeting ended with applause that sounded hollow even to those clapping. Chairs scraped against the floor, papers shuffled, people stood and left, quickly eager to escape the tension that clung to the air. Nathan lingered just long enough to flash me a smile that carried no warmth. Victoria walked past without acknowledging me, her perfume a faint trace of authority and dismissal. I remained seated, staring at the empty screen where my name should have been. The room was quiet now, the hum of the projector fading as the machine powered down. I sat there a moment longer, letting the weight of the morning settle into my bones. Then I stood, gathered the untouched pages from the table, and walked out without a word. The echo of Victoria's declaration still rang in my ears. Metasite would be her empire, she had said. I pressed my lips together as I stepped into the corridor, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. In that moment, I realized I did not need to fight for recognition in that room. Recognition was temporary. Empires could collapse, and I more than anyone knew exactly where the cracks were buried. I drove back to Cambridge that evening, the city lights flickering across the Charles River as if mocking me with their brightness. My apartment sat on the third floor of a brick building that smelled faintly of old wood and coffee from the cafe downstairs. It was quiet inside, too quiet, the kind of silence that clings to a man when there is no one waiting for him. I tossed my jacket onto the couch, loosened my tie, and stared at the stack of unopened mail on the counter. Bills, advertisements, a letter from the high school Michael attended. I left them untouched. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, staring at my own reflection in the dark kitchen window. The face staring back at me looked older than 42. The lines on my forehead had deepened, my eyes hollowed by years of long nights under computer screens and boardroom lights. I thought about Sarah, about the way her voice had trembled the night she told me she was done. It was 3 years ago in the living room of our old house in New Jersey. Michael had been upstairs blasting music to drown out the tension while Sarah stood in front of me holding her wedding ring between 2 fingers. "You never knew how to choose us over your work," she said, her voice steady but her eyes filled with tears. "Every late night, every missed dinner, every time Michael asked where you were and I had to cover for you. I told myself it was temporary, but it never was." I remembered standing there, my briefcase still in hand, files spilling out onto the couch. I tried to argue, to tell her I was building something for all of us, that Metasite would change our lives. But she shook her head slowly and placed the ring on the coffee table. "What good is success if you destroy everything else to get it, Ethan?" That sentence had followed me into every empty apartment I lived in since. Back in my kitchen now, I set the glass down harder than I meant to. The sound echoed through the room. I walked to the desk in the corner where my phone was charging. The screen lit up with a single notification, a message from Michael. My chest tightened as I unlocked the phone. His words were short, clipped, a knife to the gut. "Do not come to my graduation. You have nothing to be proud of. I sank into the chair, the phone still glowing in my hand. My son, the boy I had once carried on my shoulders at Little League games, now saw me as nothing but an absence, a shadow. I thought of the mornings I had left before sunrise, the nights I had returned long after he was asleep, the birthdays I had missed because a system crash demanded my attention. I thought I was sacrificing for him. In truth, I was sacrificing him. The memory of our last real conversation drifted back. It had been months earlier at a diner near his school. I had promised Sarah I would try to reconnect, that maybe a burger and milkshake would make things easier. Michael sat across from me, taller than I remembered, his shoulders broad, his jaw set like mine. He barely touched his food. I asked about classes, about college plans, about soccer. He shrugged at each question, eyes fixed on his phone. Finally, he looked up, his voice flat. You only care when it is convenient. You were never there when I needed you. I had no answer. The apartment felt smaller as I put the phone down. I wanted to call Sarah to hear her voice, even if it was filled with disappointment, but I knew what she would say. She would remind me of the nights she fell asleep alone, of the dinners that went cold, of the way Michael stopped waiting at the window for me to come home. I walked to the bookshelf where a framed photo still stood dusty from neglect. It was the three of us on a beach in Cape May. Michael, about 8 years old, his arms wrapped around my neck as Sarah laughed beside us. We looked like a family, then whole and unbroken. I touched the edge of the frame with my fingers, wishing I could step back into that moment. But wishes did not change the present. I sat on the couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying Sarah's words again and again. You never knew how to choose us. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was incapable of balance, of putting people above projects. My life had become a series of lines of code and quarterly reports, and in the process I had lost the only people who mattered. The anger from the boardroom that morning still simmered beneath my skin, but now it mingled with something heavier, a grief that had no outlet. Victoria could erase my name from Metasite, but Sarah had erased me from her heart, and Michael had erased me from his future. Both wounds cut differently, but both left me bleeding in silence. I checked the time on my phone. Past 11. Outside, the streetlights hummed, casting pale yellow light across the empty road. Somewhere out there, my son was planning a life that did not include me. Somewhere out there, my ex-wife was moving on without the weight of my absence. I turned the phone face down and closed my eyes, but sleep refused to come. All I could see was Michael's message burned into my mind, stark and merciless. Do not come. I lay there in the dark, the city quiet around me, and wondered how much more there was left to lose. The next morning I sat at my desk long before the sun rose, the glow of the computer screen washing over the dim apartment. I had not really slept, only drifted in and out of restless thoughts until I finally gave up and opened my laptop. The folders were familiar old directories buried under years of updates, yet my hands knew exactly where to click. Metasite. The name still carried weight in my chest, both pride and bitterness. I pulled up the earliest files, the original framework, the purchase receipts. Most people would not have kept such old records, but I had. I had saved everything, not out of paranoia at the time, but out of habit. The deeper I dug, the more I remembered each line of code, each sleepless night. Then I found it, a digital invoice dated September 2016. License purchase, Metasite Core Framework. Single proprietor, registered to Ethan Cole. Paid in full by Visa, ending in 17741. My credit card, my name, my money. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the screen. My pulse quickened. I remembered exactly why I had done it. Back then, the company refused to allocate budget for the framework, saying it was too experimental, too risky. They had told me to move on to other projects, but I could not. I believed in Medicite like I believed in oxygen. If I abandoned it, the years of work would vanish. So I had pulled out my own wallet, covered the license fee, and promised myself it was temporary. When the system proved its worth, Helixon would reimburse me. Of course, they never did. They took the working model and built upon it, forgetting entirely that the foundation had been secured with my own personal funds. I opened the license file itself, the terms and conditions written in dense legal language. My eyes scanned quickly until a line caught me off guard. License is non-transferable, non-sublicensible, and remains the property of the registered individual purchaser. The words froze me. Non-transferable, non-sublicensible, property of the individual purchaser. Me. I read it again slowly, each word searing into my mind. The license had never belonged to Helixon. Every time they deployed Medicite, every contract signed with hospitals across the country, every international demo, all of it was built on a framework legally tied to me. My breath came shallow, and I pushed the chair back from the desk. The air in the apartment felt different, charged. I stood and walked to the kitchen, filled a glass with water, and tried to steady myself. The implications were enormous. I thought back to that night in 2016 when I had clicked purchase. Sarah had been asleep upstairs, the house quiet. I had sat alone in the study, debating whether I was being foolish. We had bills piling up, Michael needed braces, and here I was spending thousands on software licensing. I had hovered over the confirm button, sweat on my palms, telling myself it was the only way forward. When the confirmation email arrived, I had felt relief, not realizing I had also set a trap that would lie dormant for years. Now, standing in my kitchen with the water trembling in my hand, I realized that trap was still there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment. I sat back at the desk and scrolled further through the documents. There were no amendments, no transfers, no signatures handing over ownership. Helixon had simply built on top of it, assuming the lines had blurred enough to make the original license irrelevant. But the contract did not blur. It was explicit. The framework was mine. For a moment, anger surged. They had humiliated me, stripped my name from the project, given credit to Nathan. Yet every presentation Victoria Kane delivered, every chart, every claim of empire rested on a foundation she did not own. She was standing on ground that belonged to me. I imagined her face when she would eventually realize it. The image filled me with a grim satisfaction. But I also knew I could not act rashly. If I confronted them now, they would bury me in legal threats, twist the narrative, paint me as a disgruntled former lead, desperate for relevance. They had money, lawyers, media connections. I had a contract and a past filled with mistakes. I minimized the files and opened my email, drafting a message to myself with the attachments, a backup in case anything happened. Then I saved the documents to an external drive and locked it in the desk drawer. My hands shook slightly as I turned the key. The city outside had fully woken by then, cars rushing along the street, horns echoing faintly through the window. People were beginning another ordinary day. But for me, the day had shifted. The cracks I had seen in Victoria's empire were no longer abstract. They were real, written in legal ink binding, and undeniable. I closed the laptop and rubbed my temples, the exhaustion from the sleepless night pressed down on me. But beneath it there was a spark, something I had not felt in years. A sense of leverage. For the first time since Sarah had left, since Michael had turned his back, since Victoria had erased me in that boardroom, I felt a current of control return. Still, I did not move forward that morning. I sat quietly staring at the locked drawer, letting the weight of the discovery settle in. I knew better than to rush. Patience had always been my strength, and now patience would be the blade I kept hidden until the right time. The clock on the wall ticked past noon and I finally stood, stretching my stiff muscles. My phone buzzed with a reminder about a meeting at Helixson later that day. A meeting where Nathan would undoubtedly parade more of my work as his own. I slipped the phone into my pocket, grabbed my jacket, and paused at the door. The license terms echoed in my mind as I locked the apartment behind me. Non-transferable, non-sublicensible, property of the individual purchaser. The first thread of the trap had revealed itself, and all I had to do was follow it. I took the red line into downtown just after lunch, clutching a folder so tight my hand ached. The train rattled under the river and climbed into light, and for a moment Boston looked almost kind. I walked from Park Street through the chill air to a brownstone near Beacon Hill, where a small brass plaque read Grant and Bell. The lobby smelled like old paper and lemon cleaner. I told the receptionist I was here to see David, and a minute later he stepped out from a hallway with the same easy half-smile I remembered. We had met years ago when he reviewed a vendor agreement for Helixson. He was the kind of lawyer who listened more than he talked, who set a yellow pad on the table and let you talk yourself into clarity. He led me to a corner office with a view of the gold dome of the State House and poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs. He took the chair beside me rather than the one behind the desk. "Tell me everything," he said without raising his voice, and slid the pad toward me. I started with the meeting, my name erased, Victoria at the screen like a conductor of someone else's orchestra. Nathan with his crooked tie and a smile that did not reach his eyes. I felt my jaw tighten as I spoke and forced myself to slow down. Then I opened the folder and laid out the records. The receipt dated September 2016, the personal card number, the email thread from my manager back then refusing budget, the license file with the heavy language, non-transferable, non-sublicensible, property of the individual purchaser. David did not interrupt. He underlined phrases with a dull pencil and made small notes in the margin. He asked for my employment agreement and I handed it over. He read the section on intellectual property, lips moving slightly as he traced the words. Assignment of inventions created within the scope of employment. Duty of loyalty, protection of trade secrets. He set the pages down and drummed his fingers once on the table. "All right," he said softly. "The framework was licensed to you, not to Helixson. The terms are clear. They could not take assignment even if they tried. The company refused to pay at the time, which matters. You disclosed the purchase to your manager by email, which matters. There is no evidence of reimbursement or a later assignment, which matters even more." He lifted the license again and tapped the line about non-transferability. "This is the hinge, Ethan. If the core is non-transferable and non-sublicensible, then every deployment that uses it without your permission is a violation. If they built revenue streams on top of it, then the damages are not small. I need to be cautious with numbers, but we are not talking about pocket change." He leaned back and looked at me. "How widely is this running?" I told him about the hospital networks in Massachusetts and New York, pilots in California, the planned push into Texas. I described the international demo that Victoria had hinted at in the last quarter. I told him about the bonus awarded to Nathan, and I tried to keep any bitterness out of my voice and failed. David nodded slowly. "They will argue implied license. They will say you worked there, you knew they were using it, you did not object, therefore you granted permission. They will waive your employment agreement and say, work for hire. But work for hire does not swallow a third-party license that explicitly prohibits transfer. They still had to own or legitimately license the underlying framework. They did not. That is not a subtle distinction. That is a cliff." He set the license down and steepled his fingers. "Now I am going to tell you something you do not want to hear. If you go loud right now, you will lose your footing. They will file a motion for a declaratory judgment to freeze the narrative. They will accuse you of trying to extort the company. They will whisper to friendly reporters that you are a disgruntled former lead. They will seek an order that you not contact their clients and that you be kept away from their systems. If you even breathe on a production server, they will accuse you of tampering and maybe try a computer fraud claim. They have money and a press office. You have the truth. The truth wins in the end, but it does not sprint. I felt heat rise in my face. The urge to march into Victoria's office and lay the contract on her desk flickered through me like a match. Then I remembered the boardroom and the way no one spoke up, and the way the applause sounded like hollow wood. I breathed out slowly. What do? I asked. We build the floor under you, David said. First, we preserve everything. Receipts, emails, the license, your employment agreement. We will create a sworn statement that lays out the sequence with dates. We will notarize it. We will make secure copies. One stays with you, one with me, one off-site. Second, you do not log into any Helixon system without explicit authorization through your current duties, and if you do nothing that could be twisted as interference. No adjustments, no toggles, no messages to clients, no warnings to hospitals. You are a bystander. Third, we wait until they expand in a way that makes the breach impossible to minimize. The larger the deployment, the more obvious the damage, the stronger the injunction when we file. He paused and gave me a long look. Waiting will feel like swallowing glass, but there is a difference between patience and passivity. While we wait, we document, take screenshots of public statements, save press releases that credit the platform, archive investor calls. The more they boast, the tighter the rope they tie. He lifted the coffee mug and took a thoughtful sip. One more thing. Check your expense records again. If there was ever an attempt to reimburse you, we need to know. If there was not, that helps. It shows Helixon treated this as your personal asset, at least by neglect, and I want any internal email where you asked for budget and were denied. The denial is a piece of the puzzle. I slid another printout across the table. The email to my manager in 2016. The response that said no funds. Move on. David underlined the phrase no funds and sat back. Good. Now we value the harm. I will engage a consultant who can estimate what portion of their revenue flows through uses of the licensed core. I do not need exact numbers for a complaint, just enough to show the court this is real money. You mentioned California and Texas. Federal court is appropriate given interstate commerce and the value at stake. Venue can be in Washington, D.C. if needed, given corporate registrations and the potential national injunction. But we do not file yet. A small smile crept into his face, the kind that said he saw the shape of the case forming in the air. Tell me about the new CEO, he said. Tell me about her style. I pictured Victoria pacing in front of the projector, voice. Cool eyes bright with certainty. She craves scale, I said. She wants headlines. She talks about eras and empires. She thinks individual credit is vanity and the company brand is everything. She will keep pushing because she believes the ground is solid. Good, David said. Empires like that build weight quickly, and weight reveals cracks. He flipped to a new page and drew a simple list. Records preserved, affidavit drafted, public claims archived. No contact with clients, no access beyond ordinary duties. He tore the page cleanly and slid it to me. I looked out the window toward the State House. The dome caught a square of winter sun, and for a second the room felt warmer. What about my job, I said. If they sideline me or fire me, if they push you out? David said, we will add retaliation to the complaint. They will be tempted to cut you loose when they sense something. Temptation is not strategy. We will not alert them. Let them make the first mistake in that lane if they insist. He stood and walked to a filing cabinet, returned with a small fireproof envelope and placed it between us. Put a copy of the license and receipt in here before you leave. I will lock it up and log it. Then email me the digital copies tonight. If anything happens to your devices, we still have the core. I nodded and felt a steadiness enter my hands as I slid the documents inside. The envelope clicked closed with a quiet satisfaction. We spoke for another hour, not about law, but about the human mess around it. He asked about Sarah, about Michael, and he did not try to fix what could not be fixed in a single afternoon. He told me life becomes a series of rooms and that sometimes you have to leave one and walk a long hallway before the next door opens. He had a way of making you feel like the hallway was not a failure but a necessary distance. By the time I stepped back onto Beacon Street, the light had softened. I could smell the river a few blocks away, that cold metallic scent that always made me think of early spring, even in the dead of winter. I tucked the list he had given me into my coat pocket and started toward the station. On the train, I watched a woman in hospital scrubs rest her head against the window and close her eyes for a moment of borrowed sleep. A kid with a backpack balanced a physics textbook against his knee. A man in a Patriots jacket scrolled through scores. The ordinary world kept moving, oblivious to the fact that somewhere in a polished boardroom a foundation had already shifted. Back at my apartment, I laid the second set of documents into my desk drawer and locked it again. I opened my laptop and created a folder labeled with a date only I would remember. I uploaded the scanned files to an encrypted drive and sent David the link with a simple note that said "Copies secured." Then I sat in the dark for a while, listening to the refrigerator hum and the city pulse beyond the glass. The phone buzzed once with a calendar update from Helixon, an all hands next week. A line beneath it mentioned an announcement on expansion. I felt a tick in my jaw and let the screen dim. I thought of Victoria's heels on the boardroom floor and Nathan's practiced smile. I thought of the sentence that had been written long before either of them arrived, buried in a license few people would bother to read. Non-transferable, non-sublicensible, property of the individual purchaser. I could march tomorrow. I could send a warning letter and watch them scatter. But David was right. That would be noise. I wanted inevitability. I closed the laptop and stood at the window. The streetlights blinked on in a line, one after another, like a fuse catching fire. Somewhere across the river, plans were being drafted and press statements polished. Somewhere a slide deck with my work at its core was being prepped for applause. I decided I would give them what they wanted. I would give them room to grow. I would give Victoria the stage she craved. I would let her step forward in that bright light, let the weight of her own ambition rest squarely on ground she did not own. And when the pressure reached the point where the structure could not bear it, I would not need to touch a thing. I turned away from the window and set the lock on the door before heading to the bedroom. The plan did not require fireworks. It required silence. It required patience. It required a single steady hand and a document that could not be wished away. I lay down and stared at the ceiling until my eyes adjusted to the dark. The quiet felt different now, not empty but purposeful. I could almost hear the slow turning of gears in a machine I had built long ago. A machine no one else had cared to understand until it was too late. I would wait. I would watch. And she would trigger it for me. The press conference was staged with flawless precision. The glass towers in downtown Boston glittered in the morning sun. Banners with the Metasite logo hung proudly across the atrium, and reporters jostled for space as the cameras rolled. Victoria Kane stood at the center, tall and commanding, her navy suit sharp enough to cut. She didn't just announce an expansion. She declared an era. Metasite would not only dominate the East Coast but push into California, Texas, and beyond. She spoke of global integration of partnerships with medical giants. To anyone watching, she was the future. Applause thundered around me, but from my chair near the side wall, I felt invisible. I wasn't introduced as a co-creator, not even acknowledged as a contributor. The title beneath my nameplate read, Consultant, a token role that made me sound like a footnote in my own story. Every slide in the presentation carried graphics I had once designed, but the credits were scrubbed clean. Nathan Miller's name glowed bright instead, attached to charts he couldn't possibly have built on his own. When the conference ended, the lobby filled with executives, clients, and reporters swarming to congratulate Victoria. Her face flashed on the evening news within the hour headlines, crowning her the Iron CEO of the 21st century. I rode the elevator down with a few junior staffers who kept their eyes on the floor, avoiding me. As I reached the ground level, I overheard two of them whispering about a rumor. Something about patient data being routed into insurance models, about algorithms not just predicting outcomes, but feeding numbers directly to providers who would profit from them. Their voices dropped when they saw me glance their way, and they quickly changed the subject. It was nothing more than fragments, but it lodged in my mind. The following week, I attended a strategy session at the corporate headquarters. I sat near the end of the long oak table while Victoria and Nathan led the meeting. Nathan leaned back in his chair, basking in the glow of recognition. The boardroom screens flicked through slides that were once mine, only now labeled with his initials. Halfway through, the CFO presented numbers that made the room buzz. New deals in California and Texas had pushed revenue projections past $200 million. Victoria's smile widened. She turned to Nathan, praising him for his leadership, and announced a special recognition. The room broke into applause as an assistant carried in a framed certificate and a large envelope. Nathan accepted both with his trademark smirk. The CFO declared his bonus openly, as if to mark the moment in history. $2 million. I watched him shake Victoria's hand, the cameras catching every angle, his grin stretching as though the empire were already his. My chest tightened, but not with jealousy. I felt something colder, steadier. They were building their empire on stolen ground, expanding faster, stretching further, planting their flags deeper into soil that wasn't theirs. I sat quietly, taking it all in while the cameras flashed and the boardroom erupted in praise. In my pocket, the copy of my license agreement rested like a hidden blade. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I simply watched Nathan's smug face glow under the spotlight, and in that silence, I knew. They were walking deeper into the trap. The meeting ended and people filed out in clusters of laughter and small talk. I lingered by the window, looking down at the city streets where cabs darted between pedestrians and delivery trucks. Their empire was growing, the headlines were glowing, and yet the cracks were already spreading beneath their feet. I left the building with the echo of applause still ringing in my ears. The cold Boston air cut against my skin, but inside I felt calm. Calm because I didn't need to tear anything down. They were doing it themselves, and sooner or later the weight of their own ambition would set off the mechanism I had buried years ago. That night, back in my apartment, I sat in silence, replaying Nathan's smug smile in my head, and for the first time I almost felt pity. Almost. The next morning I was sipping bitter coffee at the corner diner near Kendall Square when a woman slid into the booth across from me without asking. She carried a canvas bag stuffed with folders and a worn leather notebook. Her hair was silver cropped short, and her eyes carried the sharpness of someone who had seen too many lies to be fooled easily. She introduced herself as Linda Harper, investigative reporter. I raised an eyebrow. I had not spoken to a journalist in years, not since Helixson started grooming its image with glossy press releases and forbade employees from talking to the media without clearance. Linda leaned forward, her voice low but steady. She knew my name, my role at Helixson, and she claimed she had been following the Metasite expansion. She said she wanted to ask a few questions, the kind of questions that never make it into press conferences. At first, I was cautious. I stirred my coffee, watching her carefully. Reporters could ruin a man's career faster than a scandal could, but there was something in the way she spoke, not hunting for gossip, but searching for proof, that made me listen. She flipped open her notebook and slid a photocopy across the table. It was a billing statement from a major insurer, anonymized but still clear. The figures showed patient data routed through predictive models with premiums adjusted based on output from Metasite. I frowned, my fingers tracing the numbers. She explained that she had sources inside both the insurance firm and a Boston hospital system. According to them, Helixson was not just selling analytics for medical efficiency. They were selling patient data, packaging it for insurers who used the information to hike rates and deny coverage. My mind went back to the whispers I had overheard in the elevator, the quick hush when I looked their way. It was not rumor. It was real. Linda watched my expression, reading me like a page. She asked if I had noticed anything unusual in the internal deployments, anything that might confirm what she had uncovered. I hesitated, the license agreement heavy in my thoughts. I told her I had heard chatter, nothing I could prove, but the way the system was being scaled so aggressively raised questions of its own. She nodded, her pen scratching notes. Then she pulled out another folder. This one contained internal memos leaked from a Helixson executive. The language was careful, but the meaning was plain. Metasite was being used not just to predict outcomes, but to generate risk profiles that were shared outside the HE. The following week, I was back at my desk on the 10th floor, sifting through routine updates that had been pushed to my inbox. Most of it was noise status reports written to sound impressive, but empty on substance. I was halfway through deleting another chain when one subject line caught my eye. It was flagged confidential, and the sender had accidentally copied me by mistake. The name at the top was Nathan Miller. I opened it carefully, scanning the first few lines. My breath slowed as I realized what I was reading. It was an invitation to a private dinner at a luxury hotel in Back Bay. The recipients were a select group of investors, names I recognized from Helixson's board filings. The email thanked them for their continued interest and promised a discussion about new leadership opportunities at Helixson. Nathan signed it himself. I leaned back in my chair, letting the words sink in. New leadership opportunities. He wasn't just ambitious, he was already laying the groundwork to replace Victoria. Later that evening, I stayed in the office long after most people had gone home, waiting to see if anything else came through. Around 9, another email appeared in the same chain, forwarded carelessly. One of the investors confirmed the meeting time and hinted at a potential agreement. The language was deliberate, but unmistakable. If Nathan delivered, if Victoria could be sidelined, he would be rewarded with the top seat. I closed the screen and stared out at the city lights, each one a reminder of the greed that pulsed behind Helixson's polished glass. Victoria thought she had molded Nathan into her loyal lieutenant, but he was already sharpening his knife in the dark. The next day, I watched him in the boardroom, his grin wider than usual as he presented charts that were not his. Victoria praised him in front of the team, not realizing she was grooming her own successor. I caught his eye once across the table. He looked away too quickly. For the first time, I felt no anger at being erased. Instead, I felt a cold amusement. They were too busy chasing power to notice the floor crumbling under them. Victoria blind in her arrogance and Nathan blind in his hunger. That night, I printed the email and tucked it into the same drawer where the license agreement rested. The papers together looked almost poetic. One documented theft, the other promised betrayal. Both pointed to an inevitable collapse. In the days that followed, I listened more carefully in the hallways, the cafeteria, the elevator. Whispers surfaced if you paid attention. A senior manager mentioned Nathan's sudden confidence. A project lead joked about how often he was out of the office. A secretary once complained that he was booking too many private cars on the company account. None of them added up to proof, but the pattern was there. I imagined the dinner in Back Bay, the soft lights, the polished wine glasses, Nathan's rehearsed smile as he told investors he was the future of Helixon. I could see him leaning forward, promising growth, promising control, promising that with Victoria out of the way, he would deliver more than she ever could. I walked through the office the following Monday and saw the two of them standing together near the glass railing, laughing as if nothing in the world could shake them. I almost pitied her then. She believed she was the master of the empire when in truth she was already the first casualty. When I left the building that evening, the sky was heavy with snow clouds, the air sharp in my lungs. I pulled my coat tighter and smiled to myself. The storm inside Helixon was already brewing long before a single flake hit the ground. Back at my apartment, I placed the printed emails into a new envelope and locked it away. The drawer now held 3 weapons, each more devastating than the last. The license that proved the empire was built on stolen ground, the emails that showed the empire was rotting from within, and the notes from Linda Harper that hinted at the scandal waiting to erupt outside. I sat down, poured a glass of water, and stared at the envelope. I didn't need to interfere. I didn't need to raise my voice. I simply needed to wait. They would turn on each other soon enough. I leaned back in the chair, the city humming softly outside, and a thin smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. Let them plot and posture. Let them make their promises in dimly lit rooms. In the end, they were digging their own graves. They would bite at each other until one finally drew blood. And when that moment came, I wouldn't lift a finger. I would simply watch them devour themselves, knowing the trap was already set. Saturday afternoon, I stopped by Harvard Square for a coffee. The streets crowded with parents and kids touring campuses. I stepped into the bookstore to get out of the cold when I heard a familiar voice. Sarah was standing by the display of sweatshirts, her hand resting lightly on Michael's shoulder. For a moment, I froze watching them from the end of the aisle. Sarah looked older, a little more tired, but still carried herself with the same quiet grace. Michael was taller than me now, his dark hair falling into his eyes, his shoulders squared like a young man who no longer needed anyone. He glanced at the racks of shirts indifferent while Sarah spoke to him. I almost turned and left, but Sarah noticed me. Our eyes met, and she gave the smallest nod, a gesture that told me not to run. Michael followed her gaze, and when he saw me, his face hardened. We walked outside together, the 3 of us standing near the gates of Harvard Yard. Students hurried past, laughing, their futures wide open. Mine felt like it had already been written in ink. Sarah broke the silence first. Michael wanted to see a few schools in Boston, she said softly. Thought it might be good to walk the campuses. Michael shifted his weight and glared at me. You don't need to be here. I swallowed. I was not sure what words could even reach him anymore. I said I just happened to be in the square, that I did not want to intrude. But I could not stop myself from looking at him, from noticing how much he had changed. His voice was deeper, his expression colder. He was no longer the boy who used to sit on my shoulders at ball games. We walked a little further, Sarah between us like a buffer. At one point, Michael stopped and turned to me. His voice was sharp, unshaking. You chose work every time. You missed games, you missed dinners, you missed everything that mattered. You never chose me. And now you want to stand here like it means something. I don't believe you've changed. The words cut straight through me, sharper than any boardroom humiliation. I tried to speak, but nothing came. Finally, I said I knew I had failed him, that I could not rewrite the past, but I wanted to prove I was not the same man anymore. He looked away, his jaw clenched, his eyes glassy with something between anger and hurt. He shook his head. "Words don't matter," he said flatly. "You can't just say it." I felt Sarah's hand brush my arm. When Michael stepped a few feet ahead of us, she leaned closer. "If you want his trust back," she whispered, "you need to show him. Not with speeches, not with apologies, with action." I nodded, the weight of her words pressing into me. She was right. For years I had tried to defend myself with explanations, with promises that tomorrow would be different. None of it had mattered. Michael only believed what he saw. We stopped near the steps of the Science Center. Michael was scrolling on his phone, pretending not to watch us. Sarah gave me a long look. She wasn't angry. She was weary, but behind her eyes there was still a trace of the woman who once believed in me. I turned my gaze back to Michael, and something inside me shifted. For so long my fight had been about my name, my pride, my legacy at Hellickson. But standing there watching my son avoid my eyes, I realized the fight had to be about more than that. If I could expose what Victoria and Nathan had built, if I could show Michael that I was willing to risk everything for something larger than myself, maybe he would finally see me differently. He pocketed his phone and muttered that he was going to check out the library. He walked off before either of us could answer. Sarah sighed. "He is angry," she said, "but anger is not permanent. He needs to see who you really are now." I wanted to tell her that I had already set things in motion, that the Empire was not as untouchable as it looked, that soon the truth would break through their polished walls. But I kept it to myself. Instead, I said quietly that I would prove it not with words, but with what I was about to do. We stood there in the cold, the bells from Memorial Church echoing faintly, and for the first time in years, I felt something close to resolve. I was no longer chasing recognition, I was chasing redemption. When Michael returned, he barely acknowledged me. He walked past, his face tight, his stride quick. But I saw the flicker in his eyes when Sarah glanced at him, as if part of him still wanted to believe. As they headed down the street, Sarah turned once and gave me a small nod. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a door left open. I watched them disappear into the crowd, the city swallowing them in its noise. My hands curled in my pockets, steady now, my mind clear. I swore to myself then, silently but with a conviction I had not felt in years, that this time I would choose differently. I would choose to act, I would choose justice, and I would make sure my son saw it with his own eyes. 2 weeks later, the headlines blared across every screen in Boston. Victoria Kane had signed a global partnership worth $500 million. The atrium of Helixson's headquarters was transformed into a stage, with banners draped from ceiling to floor, lights flooding the space as if it were a political rally. Reporters packed shoulder to shoulder while cameras clicked in rapid bursts. I stood at the edge of the crowd, my badge granting me access, but my role so diminished that no one noticed me. Victoria walked to the podium, her stride commanding, her voice steady as she spoke about the dawn of a new era. She promised hospitals from London to Singapore that Medisight would revolutionize their systems, saving lives on a scale the world had never seen. Applause erupted again and again, every sentence greeted as gospel. I watched silent as she raised a pen and signed the contracts on live television. Her smile was wide, her hands firm, the papers heavy with ink and ambition. What she had just done was irreversible. She had deployed the framework beyond borders, binding Helixson to obligations it could never unwind. That evening I met David in his office, the blinds drawn, the room lit only by the glow of a desk lamp. I placed the fresh press release on his desk. He scanned the first paragraph and set it down, then opened the copy of the license agreement I had given him weeks before. His finger traced the key clause slowly. They just crossed the line. He flipped open a legal pad, his pen scratching quickly. The contract she signed includes international sublicenses. That means Metasite code is now being executed in jurisdictions that were never covered. Every one of those deployments is unauthorized use of your personal license. The damages compound with each expansion. What she put her name on today is a violation on a scale that no court can ignore. I sat back in the chair, letting his words sink in. The trap was no longer hidden. It was active, and she had triggered it herself with a flourish of her signature. David looked at me, his eyes serious. Ethan, you could walk into federal court tomorrow with this license and the press release. And the judge would grant an injunction before Victoria finished her next speech. The only reason we wait is strategy. The bigger they grow, the harder they fall. I felt my hands tighten around the armrest. For years, they had humiliated me, stolen my name, and now they had stolen more than that. They had stolen from every patient whose data was twisted into profit. They had stolen trust from the system itself. We sat in silence for a moment. Outside the office window, the city glowed, cars threading through the streets like veins of light. I thought of Michael, of the way his voice had cracked with anger when he told me he did not believe I could change. This was the proof I needed, not for him alone, but for everyone who had been crushed under the weight of Helixson's lies. David tapped his pen against the pad. You understand? He said quietly that once we file, it will not just be a lawsuit. It will be a public reckoning. They will try to destroy you personally, but the evidence is clean. This license is iron. I nodded. Let them try. That night I walked back along Beacon Street, the winter wind sharp against my face. I passed televisions in store windows replaying Victoria's triumphant moment, the cameras catching her smile as if she were royalty. The crowd in the footage clapped until their hands were red. None of them realized she had just set fire to the empire she built. In my apartment, I unlocked the drawer and laid out the papers side by side, the license agreement, the receipts, the internal emails, and now the press release announcing the global deal. Each piece fit together like gears in a machine that had finally started to turn. I stared at them for a long time, the room silent except for the faint hum of the radiator. I imagined the boardroom weeks from now when they realized the truth. I imagined Nathan's smirk fading, Victoria's eyes narrowing as lawyers whispered in her ear. I imagined the stock tickers plunging, investors shouting into phones, the empire cracking under the weight of its own arrogance. I closed the drawer, slowly locking it with a deliberate twist. The sound of the click felt final, like the sealing of fate. Somewhere across the city, Victoria was celebrating, toasting champagne with men in suits who believed they had just purchased immortality. But I knew better. She had already signed the order of her own undoing. I lay down in bed that night with the first real calm I had felt in years. The trap was no longer mine to build, it was hers to carry forward, and she had done it with her own hand. The complaint was filed in Washington, D.C. on a gray Monday morning. By Tuesday, the order had landed on Victoria's desk like a thunderclap. The federal court had agreed to hear the case, citing the weight of the evidence and the international scope of the violations. For the first time, Helixson's empire looked fragile. I read the news from my apartment, the scrolling headline almost surreal. A federal injunction threatened to freeze all Metasite deployments outside the United States pending review. The anchor's voice was steady but edged with shock as she described the potential fallout. Hospitals that had signed multi-million-dollar deals suddenly faced uncertainty. Investors panicked. Within hours, my phone buzzed with messages. Old colleagues who once avoided eye contact in the elevator were now reaching out cautiously, asking if I had heard, if I knew anything. I ignored them all. By the end of the week, the exodus had begun. Hospitals in California paused their contracts. A major Texas network announced it was re-evaluating its partnership. International partners from London and Tokyo quietly withdrew, citing legal risks. Each move was reported in real time, each one stripping another layer of confidence from Victoria's empire. Then came Linda Harper's article. The Boston Globe ran it across the front page, her byline in bold above the headline, "The Kane Empire Built on Stolen Ground." She had pieced together the story with surgical precision. She detailed the original license under my name, the refusal of budget, the non-transferable clause ignored by Helixson. She wove in the leaked memos about data sales to insurers, painting a picture not of innovation but exploitation. The article hit harder than any legal filing. It was not written in the language of lawyers, but in the language of betrayal. Families quoted in the piece spoke of denied coverage, of rising premiums, of children left without medication. My work, twisted by greed, had become their torment. Reading it, I felt anger and shame churn together, but also a grim relief. The truth was no longer hidden in my drawer. It was out in the world. The next morning I saw footage of Edward Kane, Victoria's older brother and a major investor, walking briskly into a Manhattan office tower. By afternoon, his statement hit the wires. He was divesting from Helixson, citing fiduciary duty to his partners. In plain words, he was abandoning his sister to save his fortune. The market responded with brutal speed. Helixson stock opened at $120 a share that Monday. By Friday, it had fallen to $64. Panic spread. Analysts filled the airwaves with speculation, and whispers of bankruptcy echoed through financial circles. The following week, it cratered further, dipping to 32, then 15. By the end of the second week, the ticker read $8. I watched the numbers slide on my laptop, the graph plunging like a cliff face. I remembered sitting in that boardroom months earlier, listening to Victoria proclaim that Metasite would be her empire. Now the empire was rubble, collapsing in real time, each tick of the market a stone falling from the walls. Inside Helixson, chaos reigned. Reports surfaced of executives resigning, of employees fleeing with their resumes in hand. Nathan Miller disappeared from public view. Victoria issued one defiant statement insisting the company would prevail, but even her words sounded hollow, stripped of the arrogance that once carried them. I did not cheer. I did not raise a glass. I sat in silence, the glow of the screen on my face, feeling the weight of it all. Justice was unfolding, but it was not clean. Thousands of employees would lose their jobs. Patients would be left in limbo as systems shut down. Families who depended on Metasite for care would face uncertainty. The collapse of an empire was never tidy. Still, I knew it had to happen. A machine built on theft and greed could not be allowed to stand. Victoria had pulled the lever herself when she signed that global contract. Now the gears of consequence were grinding through her empire without pause. On the 15th day, the stock closed at 8. The image flashed across financial news screens everywhere. I stood by my window watching the city lights flicker and thought of how quickly power could vanish. It did not require fire or blood. Sometimes it only required the weight of truth pressing down until the foundation cracked. In the distance, sirens wailed faintly through the Boston night. I closed the blinds and let the darkness settle around me. The empire was gone, and I had not lifted a hand to strike it. I had only waited, watched, and let them destroy themselves. The morning paper landed outside my apartment with a dull thud. I bent down, picked it up, and the front page stared back at me. Victoria Kane removed as CEO in emergency board vote. The headline stretched across the page, her photo beneath it, eyes, downcast lips pressed thin. She looked nothing like the triumphant figure who once commanded the stage. She looked smaller, diminished, cornered. The article detailed the fallout. The board had acted under pressure from regulators, investors, and the public. Victoria was outstripped of authority, her reputation shredded. She faced potential civil charges for negligence and misrepresentation. I turned the page and found Nathan's name in bold print. Federal investigators had opened a fraud inquiry into his conduct. Kickbacks, falsified reports, and a paper trail that tied him directly to the investor meetings I had once glimpsed through leaked emails. His smile had carried him full, but not far enough. I set the paper down and leaned back into the couch. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the radiator. I poured coffee and scrolled through the news on my laptop. Headlines piled on top of each other, each one peeling away another layer of their empire. Former allies denounced them. Politicians distanced themselves. Analysts declared Helixson a cautionary tale of unchecked ambition. I did not need to say a word. The world had turned against them on its own. By afternoon, the television carried footage of employees leaving headquarters with cardboard boxes, eyes down, voices low. Some cursed the company, some cursed the leadership, but most looked simply defeated. Helixson had once been a name people spoke with pride. Now it was a mark of shame. I clicked the screen off and sat in silence. There was no joy in watching lives upended, but there was justice in watching deceit collapse. I had not needed to shout or rage. I had waited. They had undone themselves piece by piece. That evening, as the sun dipped below the Charles River, there was a knock on my door. I opened it and froze. Michael stood there, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, his eyes searching mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said one word, "Dad." It was the first time I had heard it from him in years. The sound of it caught me off guard, soft and heavy at once. I stepped aside and let him in. He walked slowly, looking around the apartment, taking in the stacks of papers, the quiet space I had built for myself. We sat at the table. He glanced at the newspaper still open to Victoria's downfall. I saw something shift in his face, not quite forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. He had seen the news, seen the empire fall, and he knew I had played a part. He spoke quietly. "I watched the coverage. I didn't know you were involved." I hesitated, then said the only truth that mattered. "I didn't need to bring them down. They did it themselves." Michael leaned back, his jaw tight. For a long time he said nothing, then finally he whispered, "I didn't think you cared about anything but work." I looked at him carefully. I told him I cared more than he knew, that I had made mistakes, that I could not erase them, but I wanted to be someone he could believe in again. He stared at the table, then at me. His eyes were softer, though still cautious. We talked into the night. Not about the details of lawsuits or scandals, but about simpler things. His classes, his plans for college. Memories of when he was a boy, when I still showed up before everything fell apart. The conversation was halting, uneven, but it was more than we had shared in years. When he finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. He looked at me, and for the first time there was no anger in his eyes. Only a kind of tired hope. After he left, I sat by the window, the city glowing in the dark. The headlines still swirling across every network. Victoria had been cast out. Nathan was under investigation. Their names were cursed where once they were celebrated. I whispered into the quiet room, not to anyone in particular, not even to myself, but as a truth I finally believed. I didn't need to destroy them. They did it themselves. And for the first time in years, I smiled. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. The news cycle moved quickly, chasing the next scandal, the next fall from grace. Helixson still appeared on the front pages, but each story was smaller than the last. The once untouchable empire had become yesterday's cautionary tale. I walked through the streets of Boston without recognition. Just another face in the crowd, and for the first time in years, That anonymity felt like freedom. Michael began visiting more often. At first he would stay for only an hour, sitting stiffly on the couch, while we talked about his classes or college applications, but each time he lingered a little longer. One evening he asked if I remembered the summer we built a treehouse together in the backyard. I laughed, surprised he had held on to that memory, and told him it was one of the few projects I had actually finished without abandoning halfway. He smiled, and for the first time in a long time it was not strained. Sarah called once, her voice calm, almost gentle. She said Michael had told her about our talks, about how he saw me differently now. She did not offer forgiveness, and I did not ask for it. But the silence between us felt less sharp, more like a distance we both accepted. I still kept the license papers locked away in the drawer, though. They were no longer a weapon. They were a reminder of what had been lost and what had been reclaimed. The world would remember Victoria Kane as the woman who built an empire on stolen ground, and Nathan Miller as the man who tried to ride her ambition to his own ruin. I would remember them as proof that arrogance has an expiration date. On a cold Sunday morning, Michael and I walked along the Charles River. The water moved slow and heavy, reflecting the pale winter sun. He told me he had decided to stay in Boston for college. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not sadness, but a quiet gratitude. He had chosen to stay close, and maybe, just maybe, it meant he was giving me another chance. We stopped near the bridge, watching the rowers glide across the water. Michael shoved his hands into his jacket and glanced at me. "You didn't have to do what you did," he said. "You could have stayed quiet." I told him I had stayed quiet for too long, that silence had cost me more than I realized. This time I wanted him to see me choose differently. He nodded, not with full acceptance, but with understanding. That was enough. Later that night, sitting by the window with the city lights glowing beneath me, I thought about everything that had unfolded. I had not destroyed Hillexen with rage or force. I had only uncovered the truth and waited for it to do what truth always does. The empire had collapsed under its own weight. I closed my eyes and breathed in the stillness. I had lost much, but I had gained something harder to measure. A chance at redemption. A chance to show my son that even a man who had failed could choose differently when it mattered. And with that thought, I finally felt the chapter of Hillexen close. Not with applause, not with revenge carved in stone, but with the quiet knowledge that justice had found its way. And I had survived to witness it. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories of justice, betrayal, and redemption waiting, and I would love to have you stay with me for the next one.